Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar today from Globesight in Westphalia. Good afternoon to those dialing in from Europe or the Gulf. Good morning to those dialing in from the East Coast in the US. We will get started in about a minute as we wait for more people to join us, so please bear with us. Okay, let's get started. Welcome again, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We have a great conversation ahead of us today and a fantastic panel that I will introduce in a second. My name is Aline Atiye. I am part of the advisory team at Globesight, and I will be moderating the conversation today. Joining me are Tawfiq Rahim and Timo Baer. Tawfiq leads Globesight, a global development firm.
He has led high-level strategy projects with many, if not most, of the leading global multilateral and philanthropic organizations. He has also served as a fellow at the Dubai School of Government, as an expert advisor to the UN Alliance of Civilizations, and he is currently a senior fellow at New America. We also have here with us today Timo. He is the co-founder and co-managing director of Westphalia Global Advisory, a diplomatic services and political risk consultancy. Before setting up Westphalia, he served as a senior advisor at the Policy Planning Department of the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in Abu Dhabi. He has also taught international relations and European affairs at the Johns Hopkins University, the University of Bologna, and the University of Helsinki. So we're excited to have you here. I'll also quickly introduce Globesight in Westphalia, and then we'll get straight into our discussion today. Globesight is a global development firm with hubs in Dubai and New York and a growing presence across the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. So what we do is we advise a range of leading organizations and multilateral institutions who are addressing some of the most pressing issues in the global health, humanitarian, and development sectors. And we advise them on strategy, establishing partnerships, and developing innovative partnerships. As for Westphalia, it's an independent provider of diplomatic services, geopolitical analysis, and market intelligence, with a presence in Brussels, Berlin, The Hague, and Abu Dhabi, and a global network of experts and advisors. Westphalia specializes in diplomacy, market access, geostrategic analysis, advocacy, and regulatory risk. And today's webinar is really intended to provide insights on the cooperation between Europe and the GCC amid COVID-19, include the steps being taken by EU and GCC countries in response to the challenges posed by COVID-19, in addition to how Europe and the Gulf can further collaborate and leverage their relationships to greater effect. And as you can see here, I will have about 5 minutes to talk through the overall COVID-19 situation and the global efforts in response to the pandemic. I will then give it to Timo to walk us through how Europe is contributing to the global response, Tawfiq to walk us through the Gulf global response, and then both Timo and Tawfiq will discuss how Europe and the Gulf can further collaborate for greater impact. And then finally, we will have at least 15 minutes of moderated Q&A before we wrap up. So as you know, this outbreak of COVID-19 is at a critical juncture. It's now in its 6th month. It's claimed more than 432,000 lives and infected more than 7.8 million people. It's also placed a terrible burden, obviously, on nations, economies, and livelihoods around the world. I will note that the numbers we are using here are current as of June 15, which is the latest WHO report. There should be a new report coming out later today, and it would show that we have around 8 million cases and 437,000 deaths. So although we are seeing positive signs from countries and regions around the world, at the global level, we are far from safe. And actually, WHO recently announced that more than 100,000 new cases have been reported each day for the most part of the past 2 weeks. Now, across regions, what we've seen is that the pandemic has pretty much reached everywhere in every country or territory. However, we are in different phases across different countries and regions. Major economies such as China and European countries, for example, are past their peak infection rates. And attention now in these countries turns to how quickly new cases will fall from their peaks and whether a loosening of lockdown measures will lead to a second wave of infections. But at the same time, we see other countries or regions such as Latin America and some Asian countries, including Singapore and Japan, recently experiencing their first significant waves of infections. For example, Brazil has now more than 42,000 coronavirus deaths and more than 850,000 cases as the outbreak continues to spread rapidly in the country. While Africa still only accounts for a small fraction of cases worldwide, so we can see here 175,000 cases and 4,000 deaths, we also see that the pandemic is accelerating in the continent, with South Africa and Sudan as the most affected countries. So as the situation keeps evolving, some key things to keep monitoring would be the strength of the virus, the impact of climate and seasons, and the vaccine and treatment development. COVID-19 is obviously an unprecedented global health crisis, and it has also been met with unprecedented global health partnerships to accelerate the fight against the pandemic. And namely, the ACT Accelerator, or the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, is the landmark collaboration that was launched in April 24 that aims to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access to new COVID-19 technologies, so diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. The collaboration was launched by global health actors, including WHO, which is leading, coordinating the global response, Gavi, which is leading the administration and development of vaccines, CEPI, which is also leading vaccine development globally, along with other leading institutions such as the Global Fund, the Gates Foundation, and the Wellcome Trust. So the collaboration was accompanied by a call for action to the global community to support and provide the necessary resources to this collaboration, which was then followed by the coronavirus global response that Timo will talk us through in the next section. So this brings me to the end of the section, just setting the stage for the conversation ahead of us, and I'll hand it over to you, Timo, to talk us through Europe's leadership and global response.
All right, thank you, Aline. It's a great pleasure to be a part of the seminar, and I'd like to start by really thanking Tawfiq and his team at Globesight for putting this together. We have been very excited about this collaboration, so I'm very happy that we could make it happen in the end. As Aline mentioned, we'll be talking a little bit about the Europe's view on the COVID-19 situation and its global response. And I want to achieve three things in the short section of my presentation, which is first to set a little bit of the context that is shaping Europe's response to Europe's global response to COVID-19. Then I want to talk a little bit about how this response has manifested itself, and then I'll leave you with a few thoughts on, well, there may be some space for European GCC Gulf cooperation in the future, or some pitfalls as well. These are things we'll be picking up with Tawfiq later on. Just very briefly, obviously, what's sort of shaping the context for Europe is its own experience in the crisis. And, as you can see, there has been, broadly speaking, European countries have experienced this along a similar timeline, right? So things started happening in early March, and then they peaked in end March, April, and since then cases have been coming down. However, there has been a significant amount of diversity of how European countries have gone through this crisis. Some have had much higher cases, some have had much higher mortality numbers, and some countries continue to have comparatively higher numbers right now than others. There's also been a significant difference in the way that the deconfinement measures have been taking shape. So some countries have been going into deconfinement much earlier than others. A place where I live in the Netherlands, we've hardly been experiencing the confinement in the way that the Italians or the Spanish have, for example. And some others, remain still slightly in the phases of deconfinement. This has also manifested itself in the way that the European borders are opening up at the moment. So while some countries are aiming to have full borders opening again, others are still taking it much slower. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the first point is that Europe has gone through this at various speeds, but it's been something that everybody has experienced together somehow. Now, the second context that is determining Europe's response is really the economic situation, which Europe is facing as a result of the crisis. And I think in many ways it's been an unprecedented economic recession that Europe is facing. As you can see from the slide, we are facing economic contraction, which is deeper than during the global financial crisis. The EU is right now forecasting a GDP decline of around 8.2% for the entire year. However, the way this country is experiencing this is again uneven. So you see some variation between contractions in Germany, which predicted to be around 6.5%, and Italy, where the contractions predicted to be around almost 10%. And the recovery, similarly, is going to be only gradual. So these are the figures that we're looking at right now. They are most likely going to change. Finally, there's a global impact from how Europe is, how Europe's economic downturn is having an impact. So you can see that European exports and imports have contracted significantly as a result of the crisis, which is causing problems for some countries in its neighborhoods, as well as globally as well. Not least of which the Gulf countries, which are tied into Europe's supply chains. Now, Europe has taken significant measures in response to this. In the first part, can you just stay on the last one for a second? Thanks. In the first part of it, the EU and the European countries together brought a response of amounting to up to 3.5 trillion. Some of this, funding is coming from the ECB and some of the development banks. Some of this is national funding. However, the next steps will really be crucial, and there the debate is happening right now. There's a European Council meeting scheduled for later this week, where European leaders will talk about how to put Europe's economy back on track after the crisis, how to stimulate growth after we're out of the worst, and this is generating a significant amount of friction within the EU. Some seeing it, heralding it as a sort of Hamiltonian moment when the EU has a chance to really come together. European countries take on the debt of others, and this will be another step forward in European integration. While some see it more as a usual muddling through. But what we can say for sure is that the economic situation and its consequences will preoccupy the minds of European leaders in the next 6 to 12 months significantly, which of course has an impact on their global response. Next slide, please. Now, I think it's widely accepted that Europe really botched its initial response to the crisis for a variety of reasons. What you could really see at the start of the crisis is European countries taking unilateral actions, raising very significant questions about European solidarity. So you've seen some European countries imposing export restrictions on PPE gear, which have been problematic and which have been questions in light of the common European market. And you have seen border closures that were uncoordinated, etc. This is complicated or difficult not only for the immediate response to the crisis, but also the long-term question of, who do you really count on when push comes to shove in Europe? Is it your European partners or is it someone else? That sort of naturally came into the second part of this issue, was the sort of photo moment, the mass diplomacy that Europe has witnessed in the first phase of the crisis from countries like China and Russia, most notably, which have overshadowed, the sort of technical, detailed discussions on bailouts and PEP funding and so on. So people have seen, the Chinese planes and teams of doctors landing in Europe, and this has been really shaping the public imagination in Europe, and has obviously also shaped and influenced the perceptions of European leaders. Disinformation has played a role in this. The Europeans have come out repeatedly and increasingly strongly chiding Russia and China both for spreading targeted disinformation on COVID-19 and the European response. And that continues to be the case, even more recently. And finally, as Europeans have put their own interests first, that has led to some acrimony and some disappointment from its partners and neighbors. As you may recall, some of you may recall, most significantly, the president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, in mid-March went into a tirade against, how it's impossible to trust the EU anymore, and it's time to, cooperate more closely with China. And this has shaped a perception gap, or has created a perception gap about what Europe has been really doing. And this is sort of summarized in this infographic that you see there, which is about how Serbians perceive who is providing foreign financial assistance to their country and what the reality is. So shockingly, 4 out of 10 Serbians believe that China is the primary aid provider to Serbia, whereas the reality is, of course, very, very different. These are lessons, these are sort of the assessment of this first phase of the response has really shaped the EU's thinking about, or Europe's thinking overall about, how to go forward from here. And of course, now the question is whether Europe will be able to rally in the second phase and take on much more of a leadership role. And we go to the next slide, please. This is, started by sort of mid-April, that Europeans, more prominently asking themselves the question of, who, if not us, can take a leading role when it comes to the multilateral response to COVID-19. So you had a sort of, a scaled response that's sort of leading in one direction, which is towards a very strong multilateral effort when it comes to addressing the crisis, right? So it starts about mid-April, when the Alliance of Multilateralism, which is something that Germany and France have put together, and some other countries like Canada, for example, participate in, came out with a strong statement in support of global solidarity and in support of the WHO at the time when the US administration was criticizing the WHO. It then, this fed into the European Commission taking on the baton for the coronavirus global response, which is the primary effort of the EU to sort of raise funding to support international multilateral efforts. And you will hear more about this later as well. The Europeans have then taken on that basis a couple of other measures. They've created the EU humanitarian aid bridge. They've just recently launched a new campaign, Global Go Unite for Our Future, which will lead up to the 27th of June final pledging conference. And in early June, 4 European countries created an inclusive vaccine alliance that just recently struck an agreement with with a drug company for the procurement of a significant amount of vaccines for COVID-19, which will be made accessible to all Europeans. And go to the next slide, please. Now, Europe really has sort of put all its eggs in one basket, so to speak, when it comes to the multilateral effort, right? So not only has the Commission taken on the responsibility for sort of hosting the first pledging conference, and will be hosting the second pledging conference as well, but it's also committed a majority of the funding for this. So of the 9.8 billion euros pledged so far, the EU is providing around Team Europe, which consists of the EU, the European member states, and some of the banks, is providing around 66% of the overall pledging amount. And you can see some of the efforts that they'll be contributing to as a result of this. Yes, next slide, please. In parallel, the EU specifically has also stepped up its financing at home and regionally in the coronavirus on coronavirus issues. So, in the sort of response of the rabid criticism that the EU received in the initial phase, they have made a number of pledges or commitments for neighbors and partnering countries to help with the COVID-19 response, including 3.3 billion for the Western Balkans and significant amounts for the Eastern Partnership and Southern Neighborhood as well. The EU has also launched a variety of initiatives for which it made funding available that are sort of catered towards the more domestic response to COVID-19, which will continue to be, very prominent and will continue to be grown in the next phase as we go forward. Next slide, please. The same applies to the external budget of the EU. There's currently debates ongoing about the next multi-annual financial framework, so the next EU's long-term budget from 21 to 2027. This will be an ongoing debate, but the Commission has asked for an increase in funding, a significant amount of which will be going towards COVID-19 related issues. So there will be funding available in the future, and the COVID-19 response will remain very prominent on the Commission's and the Member States' mind going forward. And hence there will be sufficient scope for cooperation with other countries. Let's go on. Okay, so this is a sort of now, where does this lead us as the Europe and Gulf going forward, and particularly what can the Gulf expect from Europe when it comes to coronavirus and the potential for cooperation? I think the first point to note is that Europe will continue to dominate ODA in general, but also the coronavirus global response in terms of funding. As you can see, this is from the OECD DAC report of last year, so 2019. The EU is really, the Europe as well, it's not just the EU, together is a significant provider of development assistance and will continue to be so. Now the question is whether there's space and potential for cooperation. And I think there's just a couple of thoughts that I want to leave you with. The one is that, of course, the domestic economic response will be the primary issue for the EU going forward. So everything else will be sort of secondary when it comes to that, including how we deal with this crisis globally. And this will be the case when it comes to the procurement of vaccines as well, for example. So, here as well, the EU will, of course, try to look at its own interests first, as other countries are doing. Even though it would try to be making these efforts as inclusive as possible. There's some potential for conflict here with the Gulf countries, in particular how we manage issues of transport, airlines. You know, as we go into deconfinement, how do we restore maritime air traffic and trade routes? These will, in some cases, be difficult issues and difficult discussions, and there may be some friction with some of the Gulf countries. There's also the issue of FDI, Gulf FDI into Europe. There's a general attention towards FDI and some concern that some countries and actors will try to use the crisis to buy up the European crown jewels, so to speak, and there will be more attention towards that. And then finally is the question about supply chains and how they will change, and how this links with the Gulf's broader long-term strategies. Now, when it comes to COVID-19 more concretely, I think what you can see is a growing skepticism towards the mask diplomacy that you've seen in the first phase of the crisis. So, you know, the bilateral assistance with glossy pictures between leaders, and you know, the Europeans have seen this as undermining their own domestic efforts, and some of them are skeptical about this when it comes to international efforts as well. So I think in this respect, Gulf countries need to make somewhat a choice whether they want to go all into the multilateral response, or whether they want to you know, continue on the bilateral track as the US and China continue to do. I think there will be some catalysts for cooperation going forward. One is the upcoming German presidency of the EU, which has been billed as the Corona presidency. There will be some potential there for common efforts, most notably towards Africa. And there, I would flag the planned African Union EU summit, which you know, has already been prepped as a bit of a potential moment for you know, organizing EU contributions and responses to Africa on this issue. Some of you may have also seen that earlier in March, I think 18 Europeans and African leaders had a joint op-ed in the FT calling for a coordinated response and pledging to work together for Africa on a range of COVID-related issues. And again, I think there is potential here, given the Gulf's growing ties and interests when it comes to Africa. Coordinating these efforts, I think, is critical. And I think it will be seen whether there's a meeting of minds of all sides. I think I leave it at that and hand it to Tawfiq for the Gulf part of this.
Thanks a lot, Timo. Yes, Tawfiq, the floor is yours. We'll hand it over to you to talk through the Gulf leadership and the global response.
Great, thank you, Timo. Thank you, Aline. And it's great to be with all of you. Thank you for everybody dialing in today. I know that there's always a lot going on in the midst of the day, and we have people from across a number of time zones. I think we have a few people even on the eastern seaboard of the United States, so early morning. Hopefully you've had your coffee, otherwise you might be falling asleep with some of these numbers, but I will keep going a little bit, and maybe you'll perk up and some of it will percolate through. You know, I think for us at Globesight, we're definitely looking at, you know, the global landscape. You know, I think as Aline mentioned, we have our presence in New York and you know, in addition to our other geographic region, South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. But Europe is a space in which we often engage but maybe kind of outside in. I think that's why, we really wanted to have this discussion today, with Europe, with the presence of Westphalia, really looking at European leadership from within its priorities. And I think often when we have this conversation around partnerships, whether with the Gulf or even other regions, it's often looking at, Europe talking at somebody, or, Western institutions talking at. And what we try to encourage is a shared value approach of thinking of how you can really have not just partnership, but co-leadership. So in the Gulf, where I'm going to focus in specifically today, over the last several years, we've seen each of the Gulf countries really emerge as significant players in the development landscape, at least notably so for established institutions. Kuwait and other countries have been actually in the quote unquote aid game for quite a long time, since the early 70s, when you had the Kuwait Fund also established about, almost 40, 50 years ago. It seems to be that we often call the Gulf emerging donors, right? But ultimately, they've actually emerged for quite some time now. We're noticing them, right? So they're being noticed donors. What does contrast is the way that they give. And I think Timo alluded to that. So some European countries, actually a majority of their contributions are multilateral. In many Gulf countries, that can be in the single-digit percentages, so 3, 4, 5%. And Gulf countries tend to want to give bilaterally. I think, at Globesight, the perspective we take in many of our strategic approaches is that there is no right or wrong here. While there may be aspersions to bilateral giving, there are also benefits to it in that you can meet national interests in a much closer way. And so those are things to be explored. Obviously, the multilateral institutions in the global response are important. Now, just on this slide, we have a little bit of the ODA numbers. Some of these are updated. Some of these are kind of through informal channels. But, really going back to the slide that Timo showed around the global ODA picture, when we look at Europe, of course, Timo's Europe, I think, might have included like the UK expanded border. So it's the 1990s vision of where Europe was going to be. I'm Canadian. Maybe they're going to take over Canada. I don't know, Timo.
We're very inclusive in Europe.
Very inclusive, right? But if you looked at, the other is being paced by the Gulf, right? And the Gulf is actually the most significant group of donors globally that has not really been engaged in a systematic and systemic way. And when it is engaged, it is towards, please give us money to our existing institution, right? And as you know, in Europe, most of the institutions that the Europeans are giving to are either based in Europe or are European. It makes it much more palatable. They're hiring European scientists, funding European institutions, and the Gulf notices that, and that's something that's playing in the back. But just from a per capita basis, the Gulf are leading the way in terms of their donor contributions, and that's just an established fact right now. That is happening. Now, is it being spent in the right places? That's an open question. Next slide, please. So we've seen that in the last decade, not only has funding and donor aid is being there, but there's been a lot more significant growth around multilateral institutions for global health. And so since, let's say, the beginning of the last decade to the end of the 2010s, we saw a threefold increase to core set of institutions in terms of the funding for global health. That includes the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. It includes the Global Fund for HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Financing Facility. So, we've seen a tremendous increase, and a lot of that has been paced also by the United Arab Emirates, which has taken a specific view on global health, but other countries have been very active and diligent in those contributions. If you go to the next slide. what we saw last year, building on 2017, was the Reaching the Last Mile Forum in Abu Dhabi, which was a landmark event that demonstrated global leadership from the Gulf. So here was Abu Dhabi convening and originating an idea for a forum with thought leadership around disease elimination in partnership with other global stakeholders, and announcing different funds, disease elimination institutes, and pledges for polio in this case as well, showing a multifaceted approach to leadership. So traditionally we would see that initiatives would originate outside the Gulf and come to the Gulf for kind of support. And here was Gulf leadership on global health originating from within the Gulf. Now it's hard, to kind of put that into the global picture, because as Timo showed, 50 to 60% of, aid is still coming from Europe. And that ends up kind of being the determining factor of the aid agenda, and the institutional depth is there. And also the Gulf can be slow to take leadership around an issue in real time, especially with institutional depth. If you go to the next slide. Now with COVID-19, it's been an interesting kind of picture. Just like in Europe, obviously, the situation of foremost concern is domestic. And that's the case anywhere in the world. And the Gulf has actually had a great number of cases, one of the highest case counts in the world per capita. Qatar is actually at the forefront of that. And after initial controls, what we saw is really a scale up of those numbers in migrant communities and others. And so those numbers have kept being high. We have seen perhaps a slight flattening of the curve, as people like to say, but the case counts are still in the top 15, 20 globally, alongside South Asia, Latin America, North America, and Europe. Now, despite having a high case count, the death toll has not been high. So that is something interesting to kind of take note of. But the impact in the economy has been significant. Borders are closed. A lot of the tourism industry, for example, in the UAE suffer. The logistics and aviation sector are suffering. And for a while, as we can see from the oil prices, they dipped. I know that everybody on the call bought, oil in early April, so everybody's doing well, who's retired. And it was smart. Looking at this graph, you're probably kicking yourself saying, what did I do wrong? I should not be working anymore. But it always feels like things are going to go lower when they're going low. But things kind of bounce back, and we've seen that with the oil prices. So we might see some stabilization around the Gulf economy, but that has meant a little bit of reticence around the global response, maybe than we would have seen otherwise. Go to the next slide. So, the response from Gulf countries has been, I would say, frequent and direct, right? It's being bilateral all across. Well, this is an example of some of the kind of assistance that's been provided, but it spanned the globe from Costa Rica, even to China, down to, of course, Yemen, into Southern Africa, and into Italy, right? I mean, at the height of Italy's crisis, you had Qatar, the UAE, supporting Italy, and it was quite interesting to see. It was on PPE. We saw it on testing kits, other types of aid, and we've continued to see it. There's an air bridge that's being facilitated with WFP by the UAE and Ethiopia, and we've seen a lot of different examples. If we go to the next slide, that support has extended to leadership, right, where and when possible. So Saudi Arabia, as many of you know, are at the chairing the G20, and whatever you think of Saudi and its policies and existentially as a country, I mean, at the Gulf you can never have a conversation except some existential evaluation. But Saudi is chairing the G20, and they've stepped up in terms of convening the global conversation. And that, at the time, I mean, with really a lot of due credit to Saudi Arabia, there was nobody convening around coronavirus. So now we're looking at these nice, global citizen who are, partners of ours, festivals and announcements and celebrities and politicians and people tweeting back and forth and retweeting and liking tweets. But if you went back to April, early April and late March, there was nothing. There was no real coordination. And the ACT Accelerator that Aline talked about, and for people who on this call are working on it, know for a fact that there was a lot of work behind the scenes to even make sure that was coordinated. And it wasn't by the governments. The governments were late to the party on coordinating. They got coordinated by all the institutions and independent actors. And one day somebody will tell this story, but it won't be for me to do that. But the Saudis, through the G20, put together a platform of support, put it on the agenda, and paved the way for a lot of the conversation. If we go to the next slide. I think what was great was also that there has been contribution to the multilateral responses. Now, we talked about WHO had an appeal, Gavi has had its replenishment, CEPI has been mobilizing resources for R&D for vaccines, and of course the UN has had its humanitarian appeal. And across the board, in a number of the countries, these different institutions have been supported. And the UAE has been very active bilaterally and has been very engaged with many of these institutions historically. And we don't have the Global Fund here. They had their replenishment earlier, where the UAE is a significant contributor, as is Qatar, as is Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait to a lesser degree. But the UAE has not stepped up to the plate as much as we would have expected yet. And I think there is a moment for the UAE in the coming months to demonstrate that leadership. And maybe that's something Tim and I, will talk through a little bit in the next section, but that is there. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there are a number of organizations engaged in this response. We've put a few of the logos here. You might recognize them. But basically, it's being led from within the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, by some of the aid institutions, as well as some of what we call the semi kind of official foundations. So in Qatar, you have Education Above All Foundation. It's chaired by Sheikh Amoza, the mother of the Emir, the previous First Lady. And they work closely with QFFD, the Qatar Fund for Development. In the UAE, you'll have Mohammed bin Rashid Global Initiatives, MBRGI. They're doing a lot of the kind of bilateral aid delivery, especially when Dubai is involved. Some of that went to the UK. That's, of course, spearheaded by the ruler of Dubai, the Prime Minister of the UAE. But ultimately, in each of these countries, the decision-making around the aid apparatus goes to the highest echelons of government. And so, in a time like this with the COVID response, that is where the engagement needs to happen on the leader-to-leader level. Unlike some of the budgetary processes in Europe, at the Gulf level, you're not going to just have institutional provisions earmarked, ready for this and that issue. So it's really at that leadership level of engagement that you kind of want to, hit it through. I think just before we transition to the last part of the discussion, just hitting home, I think, what the moment presents for ourselves. We are a world of, 7.5 billion people. The coronavirus crisis is cutting across every country, but across a diversity of geographies where what's important is funding, it's political reach, it's supply chains, it's culture, and we're all in this together. And so the inability of diverse actors to find ways to lead together is going to lead to the failure in our response in this global pandemic. It is up to people, leaders, countries, institutions within places like Europe and the Gulf to find ways to jointly lead, where you have to respond to each other's input, respond to each other's interests, not just say, here's what we're doing, will you come support us? Because that's the only way you're going to get a bought-in solution that really reaches where we need to reach when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa, when we talk about South Asia, when we talk about a supply chain and a distribution cycle for this vaccine that really can touch across the vast majority of the world that's going to need kind of this response. And so with that, Aline, I'll give it back to you to kind of prod us through our discussion and the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Tawfiq and Timo. That's very insightful. And we are receiving some questions from our participants, so we'll make sure to have some time at the end to address them. If you haven't done so already, please use the Q&A chat box. So Tawfiq and Timo, we talked about how Europe has been responding, how the Gulf has been responding. How do you think Europe and the Gulf can further collaborate looking ahead and leverage their relationships to greater effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you have obviously on the slide a number of upcoming moments. I think Timo spoke about a couple of upcoming moments. You know, I definitely think those are critical, right? Where those leaders are coming together. And I think, as you know, Timo, obviously Europe with its leadership, not just at, you know, the EC level, but with, you know, the different presidents and prime ministers who each have very strong personal relationships and country level relationships. But similar to the Gulf, where I think the reach of, you know, leadership within the UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, the ability to pick up a phone, the ability to bring people together is also unparalleled. And so if they were able to combine that power at some of these leaders summits, I think it would be tremendous in terms of the convening.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to this, I think that it's really in the hands of Europeans and the Gulf countries to lead the global response at the moment. You know, you have of course Canada as well, and some others, but you know, you have a lack of leadership when it comes to, you know, the greatest powers when it comes to this. So, you know, neither the US nor China nor Russia is stepping up to the plate here. So this provides an opportunity for Europe and the Gulf countries to come together on this. Now the question is whether it will, of course. And I think here it's very important that we learn the lessons from the first phase of the crisis and avoid the same issues in the second phase of the crisis. Just as some countries instrumentalized PPE gear, you know, in the critical phase, there will be a temptation to try to instrumentalize vaccines. And, you know, I think if you replicate that in the second phase of the crisis, that would be very unfortunate indeed, and will be at the cost of everyone. So, you know, I think the Europe and Gulf have an interest to come together, try to frame this second part of the response more jointly. Obviously, the first moment to do so is the upcoming June 27th summit, but there will be other possibilities as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, like, you know, there's those moments that are coming up, you know, that we mentioned. I mean, in terms of the funding, you know, that's something where, Timo, you know, I think I'm finding, you know, and we are that, you know, is there a second wind to the Gulf in terms of funding? Because I think that you know, that would demonstrate something, I think, key to the European leadership to say, hey, we're gonna co-fund a part, and maybe it's the humanitarian, you know, component, right? Maybe that's where the Gulf has an edge, the established relationships. But I think that would show that there's a shouldering of leadership. But the third one is one you also talked about, which is, you know, like the supply chain. You know, you look at aviation, logistics. It seems the Gulf is primed to kind of help with some of the vaccines, the manufacturing into Africa and Asia. But is that too political?
It's interesting to note that we have humanitarian aid bridges both in Europe and the Gulf, you know, and you know, there probably could be more coordination on these. I think there will be some issues when it comes to, oops, something is happening. Is the slideshow up? So, okay. So yeah, I think finding a way to cooperate on those transport issues will probably be difficult in some cases, but necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim and Timo. I think we had some technical issues here. So thanks a lot for the discussion. I think that brings us to the end of the presentation, and we will open now for Q&A, which I will moderate. So we also received some questions actually ahead of the webinars. I will start with the first question. What limits EU and GCC ability to coordinate tourism between the two regions during COVID-19? Maybe Timo, you can start, and Tafiq, you can add to that.
So is it to coordinate tourism?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Well, I think that you know, in Europe there's now an effort made by the EU to try to establish some standards when it comes to the conditions of how to you know, reopen travel with countries for tourism purposes. Some of the criteria that they're putting out for that have to do with obviously the domestic situation when it comes to COVID-19. So the number, the headcounts of new cases as a percentage of the population, as well as the sort of, you know, the trends and the overall response that they've seen. And then there will be also an assessment of the airport facilities and you know, how fit they are for restoring tourism. You know, I have no doubt that the Gulf countries you know, will be able to perform very well on these things, in particular on the airport facilities, given the advanced stage of the infrastructure and the many measures that places like Emirates and Etihad have already taken, and Qatar Airways. So you know, I think there is potential there to come together. Of course, the current situation in the Gulf, as Taufik described, is still a little bit unsettled. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts as well on why you think that is, because some of the confinement measures have been very, you know, very strict in the region, and you know, whether in some ways the Gulf will be more vulnerable in the second phase as you know, as you move towards restoring travel links as well.
Thank you, Timo. I have a couple of questions related to Yemen and the Middle East conflict. So the question is, what does COVID-19 mean in terms of the prospects of Gulf-Europe cooperation on combating COVID-19 in Yemen and addressing the COVID threat and conflict affected states in the MENA region? Maybe Tafiq, you can take this on.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the case count is rising in Yemen, and I think it's a global, you know, crisis when we see a fragile state in which the case count's rising, because it can really quickly spin in a situation out of control. You can't have a lockdown. You don't have the restrictions. You don't have any of the contact tracing. You have migrant populations. And so I think there has to be significant collaboration there. I think the political connectivity of the various Gulf countries, the funding, but then also then linking up with the different kind of, I think, technical expertise in Europe is going to be critical. And I think you can replicate that across conflict affected states. I think that's where there might be a real opportunity for collaboration, is around the UN humanitarian response, and not just on raising funds. I mean, I think, you know, there might be UN colleagues on the line. You can't just keep sending bills of, you know, funds, you know, please fund us another 150. Where's that money going? I'll be honest, you know, looking from behind the scenes, it's not clear to me that money is going somewhere that's efficiently accounted for. We need to take a solutions-based approach and really think about, in these humanitarian situations, in the conflict, what are we trying to solve for? Is it access? Is it supplies? Is it bringing different stakeholders together who are not? And then I think we can see a greater return, especially in the pandemic. If it's about getting 20 tribes together and the business leaders and a few political stakeholders, that's not about money. And so there needs to be a little bit more thinking than just, I think, the aid departments of different institutions or countries saying, who's going to give us our next $50 to $75 million. Then I do see true collaboration between Europe and the Gulf and leading to results. Let's be perfectly honest. The last decade, European Gulf collaboration, anybody's collaboration has led to very limited progress in any of these conflict-affected countries. Now we're talking about a conflict-affected country with a pandemic. So we have to just think differently. And I think people need to push within the countries to think differently about how to challenge these issues, tackle these challenges, not just say, where's that next dollar coming from? You know, I don't know what you think, Timo.
Well, yeah, no, I think it's actually a really great question of how Europe and Gulf can come together, and you know, when it comes to COVID-19 in Yemen and other conflict affected countries, right? Because the potential, I think, is huge. You know, I think it's where there's space there to establish a sort of a new basis of trust and a new dynamic in what has been a sort of very difficult space when it comes to Europe and the Gulf, right? So, you know, I can see there certainly is interest on the European side to do more in these areas. There certainly will be considering, something put on the table from part of the Gulf countries. However, the real problem is you have to leave politics outside the room, right? And the question is, can we do that? Because if you don't, then it gets complicated, and then the distribution of this assistance in these places will not be a heavy experience. So you know, that's a question to all the participants, both the Europeans and the Gulf countries, whether they're able and willing to do so. If so, I think there's a great potential for a fresh start, setting the stage for reconstruction aid afterwards and cooperation in all kinds of spaces. But whether they're prepared to do that, I'm not entirely sure.
Thanks, Timo. Thanks, Tawfiq. So we have some more questions, but unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the webinar. Thanks again to our speakers and to those who's joined us. Before we go, I want to make sure people know how to find you, Timo and Tim, for follow-up questions. So we will be following up after the webinar to all participants with their respective contact info. And with that, I'll leave it to you, Tawfiq, and then Timo for closing remarks.
Timo, do you want to go first with kind of a closing remark?
Yes, of course, I can. I will keep it short. Look, working now in the European space, but have been spending many years in the Gulf as well. I think it's always frustrating to see that there's so many issues where there's a potential for cooperation between the two sides and working together. That there's so many common interests when it comes to COVID-19 and other global issues, but somehow oftentimes things don't come together in the end. I'm really hoping COVID-19 provides an opportunity to build that bridge. And, obviously this is our little attempt through the seminar to cooperate, to contribute to that. So over to you, Tawfiq.
Yeah, no, I think thanks for passing that baton, Timo. And I think behind the scenes, that's what we're always endeavoring to do. Where we can find moments and places of intersection and opportunities to drive an agenda forward. And I think that's what can happen around the coronavirus situation. There's an opportunity to really bring together different skill sets, different interests, different spheres of influence. And you have to start somewhere. And I don't think it means that if you collaborate in one arena, you're going to necessarily align on the other. And that's okay. You can put aside those places where there are challenges and find the opportunity here. And I think what I will say, leaving it kind of with us for the closing is we don't have a choice. The situation in the world is too dire. not just in the coronavirus pandemic, but the underlying inequality, which is, I think, the challenge both domestically and globally that is leading to the exacerbation of circumstances that people find themselves in during this pandemic. And the world is fractious, you know, and I think Europe and the Gulf are actually regions and with leaderships that can cut across some of the divides. And so we have a true opportunity that could be lost, actually, if we don't find pathways of collaboration between the EU and the Gulf on these global issues. So thank you.
Great. This brings us to the end of the webinar. Thanks, everyone, and have a good day.